because I closed the window. Thank you.
W12 Exchange of the Year, Dimensions of Water Partnerships and Localization. My name is Judy Jane. I am the Communications Associate with W12+, and I am happy to get our exchange started. W12+ is a movement of motivated organizations that connect, catalyze, and incubate urban water solutions. W12+ is jointly run by the Institute for Ecological Civilization based in the US and SOS, a nonprofit based in South Africa. Today's panel is part of the W12+ Exchange, a series of conversations to help transform research, experiences, lessons learned, and more into actions for each of you today. Localization has been a buzzword in the development sector since the 2016 World Humanitarian Summit. Localization is defined here as local actors taking ownership and driving efforts across policy and programming. Over the last few years, efforts have been varied and are largely falling short. Localization is a process until it is the default norm and may take more resources and time to establish in the beginning of projects, but will ultimately ensure sustainability and effectiveness in the long term. Today's panelists from the private sector, international NGOs, and academia will share their experiences in creating and working in partnerships between global North and global South actors, whether with technology, water security, and climate change, or research. What makes an effective partnership for localization? We hope you come away from today's panel with new insights and ideas for collaborating with your partners, and join us in answering our core question for today's panel. What do you think is the most important ingredient for an effective partnership for localization in the water sector? We encourage you to join the conversation in the chat and to ask questions using the Google form link. Our panelists for today are Dr. Bogani Nkube, Kimberly Kubecki, and Braulio Moreira. Dr. Bogani Nkube is a water and agricultural scientist and associate professor at the Cape Peninsula University of Technology in South Africa. She works on smallholder farmer coping and adaptation strategies for water use during drought. Kimberly Kubecki is the global leader in sustainability, advocacy, and communications for DuPont Water Solutions. She focuses on the development and implementation of sustainability and advocacy programs that drive business growth. Last but not least, please welcome Braulio Moreira. Braulio is the director of the 50-Liter Home Coalition. He is committed to the development of strong collaborations among various stakeholders to help cities adapt to climate change and avoid acute water problems. To our panelists, thank you so much for taking the time to be here and for being the ones to get our conversation started. I'd like to make one more reminder for the question and answer period today. Please click on the Google form link in the chat to submit your questions. You can also find us on social media at W12_programs. I will now pass the microphone to our moderator for today, W12 Plus Projects Director, Ellie Leaney. Thank you all.
Thank you, Judy, and thank you everyone for joining us today and our panelists for being here. I'm super excited for today's conversation around partnerships and localization for SDG 6, water security broadly. So at W12, as Judy said, we connect often siloed stakeholders who are working towards the same goal. This conversation is a microcosm of that. I'm thrilled to have our three panelists today here for this conversation. So in today's panel, we'll be centering around this topic of localization and partnerships. We have a few questions that we'll go through, and we're aiming for this to be really dialogical, informal, and a fun conversation about what these amazing people are working on in their day jobs and what the future of partnerships and localization can be coming out of this. So without further ado, let's get started with our first question. And we'll start with Kimberly for this one, and then go on to Bongani and then Braulio. So the first question, you each bring so much experience and expertise from your respective backgrounds. Can you talk to us a little bit about how you got started working in the water sector? Just briefly tell us your story, Kimberly.
Sure. Thanks so much, Ellie. And yeah, excited to be part of this group. So, I think certainly I could start with sort of schooling and academia and career stuff, but I have to go back a lot further. When I was a little girl, my dad, I come from a long line of sort of farmers and teachers in Ontario in Canada. And so I just grew up with dirt under my fingernails and learned a lot about how important water was in terms of crops and the cycles and the weather. And I couldn't, it was probably not a waking moment that my dad didn't talk about the weather. So I think it was just sort of ingrained in me as a kid how important water was and the effect it had just on our livelihoods. So I think that sort of thing, if it's in your heart, it sort of carries along. But I've always been interested in sort of, how to protect the environment and moved much into sort of science and technology as my route to making an impact. And so that's carried out through my life from, backgrounds in chemical engineering and going into clean technologies, and then moving from that really into water. So did a lot of work in the energy space, and then moved into water, which is actually much more complicated and complex. So definitely needs a lot of great minds working on those issues. And as we know, water is local. So this is a really apropos conversation. Thank you.
Thank you, Bongani.
Thank you, Ellie. My history in the water sector is in and out history. I'm actually from an agricultural background. This is what I studied at first. And then in my first job, I just realized so many problems with water. And that's how I ended up doing water resources engineering and management degree, which I parked sort of when I finished it, and I went back to agriculture. And I also worked for a network, which was actually linking water institutions. And that's how I then ended up working for nonprofits, looking at water supply for communities in Kenya, in Zimbabwe. I've jumped from country to country. But to cut the story short, in 2013, I came to South Africa to work on a drought project. So focus was on farmers. But as I was going through my research in the field, I realized there was always a mention of water, access to water, access to water. So I engaged with the catchment management agency just to understand what was going on. And that's how my first project on looking at water allocation, access to water, water resource management was conceived in South Africa. And yeah, I've been pursuing that for the last 9 years. And I think I'm still continuing with it. I'm looking at governance and economics of water and sanitation sector institutions. That's my main focus for the next 5 years. So yeah, that's how I ended up doing so much water. And of course, I participated in W12 in South Africa, and that actually created even more linkages. Hence, that's why I'm here. Thank you.
Yes, thank you. That was our last in-person event in Cape Town, January 2020. Yep.
Yes. Yeah.
And then the world shut down. All
Yeah.
right.
Thank you.
It's a pleasure to be here. So I'm originally from Chile in South America, and when Chileans grow up, we all experience El Niño and La Niña as atmospheric, events that happen on a regular basis. So for us growing up, in the condition of drought or just, surrounded by flooding is something that, is part of our lives. But very interestingly, when I moved to Europe for, personal reasons and also to study, that wasn't a reality that was taking place in Europe at the time. And in my professional career, I started working with cities. And when I started working with cities, initially supporting developers, supporting city governments in large infrastructure projects, water was always one of the key topics. But then very interestingly, when I started working more in the space of resilience, and I had the pleasure to work with organizations like International Federation of Red Cross, as well as Rockefeller Foundation and UN in resilience-related projects, then water became a much more critical issue. And one of the elements that I truly enjoyed, particularly when I had the role of strategy director in 100 Resilient Cities program, was to support cities. And when you support cities, when you advise cities, you realize that that's one of the highest stresses that cities experience on a day-to-day basis. And this is something that we found in cities as diverse as Minneapolis in the north of the US, also in Panama City in Central America, where flooding is something that happens just on a day-to-day basis. Santa Fe in Argentina, where they have experienced very tragic events of flooding, but yet people don't have sufficient access to water. So I feel, rather than considering myself a water person, I'm a person that, enjoys working with city governments, with public sector, and for them it's just such a critical topic.
Thank you. It's really interesting to see the lived experience as such a fundamental part of this sort of career path that everyone's chosen, and just your connection to the natural world. So that it's just interesting to see that. So my next question, getting a little more granular around our topic here, is I would love to hear a bit about what you all are currently working on in related to water in particular and partnerships. What do these partnerships in your jobs look like? Who's involved? And if you could just talk a bit about that. I think we'll start with Bongani, if you don't mind.
Thank you, Ellie. As I mentioned, I've worked with local communities, mainly smallholder farmers, but our approach now in the new chair in governance and economics of water and sanitation sector institutions is literally looking at all stakeholders from all levels, from the government to municipalities, to provincial governments, to catchment management agencies. But our focus at the end of the day is equity. How do we ensure that there is equity in access to water? So we are looking at a number of elements when it comes to water. We are looking at water pricing. We are looking at the tariff structure. So those are some of the things that we'll be assessing in the next few years. But there is also another element still which links to smallholder farmers. We are still looking at issues of access. what mechanisms are hindering smallholder farmers from accessing productive water, not just drinking water, but productive water, that is water for agriculture. So in that space, we are going back to try to understand a bit more how governance structures are hindering smallholder farmers. We are not just starting this from scratch, we are building this from projects that have been looking at how irrigation boards that were supposed to convert into water use associations after 1998 are still functioning as irrigation boards. And because of that, the structure is literally hindering access from what we call the historically disadvantaged communities in South Africa. So we are trying to unpack that. We have worked with the government, Department of Water and Sanitation, the Water Research Commission. We have worked with them in actually taking a closer look at mechanisms of accessing water by smallholder farmers, looking at how water use associations are being created, what is making them not created, because out of the 300 that were supposed to be created from 1998, we only have 99 at this stage. So we are looking at what are those issues or problems that are hindering these processes from taking place. And of course, we are working with the irrigation boards and water use associations in this space. So in short, those are the spaces that we're working in. We are looking at both rural water and water in municipalities, water in cities. Thank you.
Thank you. Kimberly?
Yeah, so I'll start high level and I'll go down to the local level. So, I'm at DuPont Water Solutions, right? So our focus is on we're a sort of a supply side of technology, right? So purification, separation, components, and large and small that can be configured in a number of ways to really make any quality of water that you have, and you can clean it or treat it to any really quality you need, whether that's for drinking or agriculture or anything else, or an industrial application. So just to kind of level set everyone, if we're coming in from sort of that technology solution provider angle, but at the same time, we feel, we also have a role to play in supporting water access for all and really making an impact on SDG 6. So, we have this concept of a water optimized world where we're actually using water in a way that's appropriate for its purpose. And we feel technology has a big role to play in that. So, part of, this water optimized world is obviously we have to optimize ourselves and, be a steward ourselves as a manufacturer, optimize our customers and provide those innovations, but then optimize the world. How do we do that? And that's really kind of, I think, the space of this conversation. And so when we think of that, we think of, okay, so we think of partnership right away. And, what are those murky, social impact partnerships that we can have that can make that impact on the ground, whether there, so we just announced one with water.org, for an example. We've been working with W12 for years, and that's been a very, exciting partnership for us. And we made a lot of impact and we hope to make more soon. But also, we have a lot of these sort of projects on the ground. And, sort of they sort of come from the ground up. And I'd say some of the ones we have already online on our website are pretty exciting. Project rainwater harvesting and using our ultrafiltration in Tanzania. We have a second one coming up in Tanzania that's exciting. It's going to be using renewable energy and providing more clean water to the communities there. And our role there is, we have people all over the world. So we have these passionate people that can connect with the local communities and the partners, but also help with bringing the technology to the project, bringing training to the project. So we have a number of those going right now. We have some that are already available. We like to write, make videos, write case studies on these, but we also want to make sure there's longevity there so that, we're providing training, or if something goes wrong, we're there to come and help and that things don't sort of fall off the rails. So, so I guess, from bigger partnerships down to actually implementing local projects, that's where, we like to play. with technology, with training, with people who are super passionate, who are in those localities, who can help drive those discussions.
That's great. Braulio.
Yeah, I think, I mean, partnerships is such an interesting topic. I think on a very high level, I think there are lots of experiences that I would say I shared with Kim in that perspective. There's one big level that it's around how organizations, partnerships, collaboratives get organized. And in the experience in 50 Liter Home, it has been led by, where this collaborative coalition comes from, which is from the collaboration between private sector organizations. Now, what I would say is very interesting about our journey in the last 2 years is that very quickly we realized that we had to engage with public sector organizations and voices from the civil society. And that includes not only city governments. As of last November, the co-chair of our coalition is the mayor of Phoenix in Arizona. But also we're starting engaging more and more with water utilities or representatives of water utilities, which are predominantly public sector organizations. So this is I think this is our journey, which I feel has been heavily influenced by the fact that really our challenge is how we can create innovations that are then really relevant to many contexts, and also that they can be scaled up. So because that is our objective, we realized that we had to engage with a more diverse group of stakeholders. And I think this is, this is fantastic. But then on the other hand, and similarly to what Kim was sharing as well, when we start exploring the opportunities on the ground, then the arrangement of partners is very different. And that's perhaps the beauty when we talk about partnerships, is that whilst we might bring ideas or concepts or just approaches and tools, we need to be able to then identify what are the key voices that, of course, are able to support with technology, with advice, with tools, but also very importantly, what are the opportunities for us to learn from? Who we need to listen to in order to identify what are the right solutions. And that is precisely the moment in which we, 50 Liter Home Coalition, are. Because right now we're scoping a number of projects on the ground, initially 2 in North America, and then also a couple in the global south that unfortunately I cannot describe in detail. But for me, if I can describe that process and the commonalities of those processes, it's really about identifying those local partners. And for me, and perhaps it's my personal fascination, but also a fascination we share in the coalition, is what are we going to learn and who are we going to learn that from, so that then we are able to make a contribution, because otherwise we're not able to bring value. And we might be creating more problems than positive impact. So that's our approach. And yeah, as I said, and similarly to Kim, there are various levels, and always is really important to think about the scale in which we want to operate in order to identify the right stakeholders.
That sets us up so well to dive into our core question. And I just love that what we're talking about today with partnerships for water and SDG 6 is really about identifying local partners and knowledge sharing, like you say, Braulio, and I think all of you touched on. So now I want to ask just broadly our core question that we've asked you all to think about before this. And you can, whoever wants to answer first can jump in, and feel free to self-organize with your responses to this. To the core question, what do you think is the most important ingredient for an effective partnership for localization in the water sector?
Hey, Ali, I'm happy to jump in. So yeah, no, I appreciate that one single question. It kind of makes you step back and think about it. And my first instinct, well, it's communication, of course. But then I thought, well, wait a minute, there's probably something that has to happen before that. And I think that thing is building that trust, which is really critical, because it's you know, it's where you kind of get clear on the single version of the truth, what the common goal is, and the shared values. So, and you know, I think the broad goal might be easy enough, like it could be, you know, provide access to a particular community or thing. But I think you kind of need to click down a little bit, you know, what are those goals underneath that? And what's everybody's hopes and fears, and getting that out on the table, I think is really important. You know, the other thing I've learned, you know, doing this work is this takes a lot of time, actually, a lot of conversations. Some people might need to stretch one way or the other to get that trust built up. I think also, you know, as part of that exercise, you need to understand, you know, what is everyone bringing to the table, and what is everybody's, you know, specific goals in terms of that project, because they might not be the same, but if you put it all together, then you can make it work. So, you know, I think the other piece to that is, you know, what are you basing that off of? You know, sometimes there's a mistrust, you know, coming in, like, does the community trust the government? Does the government trust business? Do they feel like, well, DuPont's a big corporation and you're just gonna try and, you know, make money, and you're, you know, so like we have to kind of get over everybody's assumptions and just sort of be people around the table. And I think what can help there is, you know, if you've got some data that you can all agree on, you know, is there some foundational information, whether it's geographic, demographic, whatever the right data is, you know, that helps drive the key tenets of a project. And I guess I would just say this is not an easy thing, and communication is a piece of it, but, you know, without getting that trust fabric worked out, I think any kind of local project will be doomed. So that's really my key one thing, if I were to pick one thing.
Bongani,
Thank you, Kim. Thank you, Kim. I would like to pick from there, actually, because surprisingly, that is also my one big thing when it comes to partnerships. But before I go there, I just want to reflect back on something that you mentioned about that you are taking rainwater harvesting tanks to Africa and things like that. We've got our famous drought in Cape Town, 2015-2018, one of the biggest droughts ever experienced around here, and one of the coping strategy provided to communities, to smallholder farmers, to vulnerable, was rainwater harvesting tanks. And it's interesting that, what we found in the field is that these rainwater harvesting tanks were just not given. It was a partnership between the Catchment Management Agency, between the Department of Agriculture and the municipality. Why this partnership worked so well is because agriculture is on the ground and they are trusted. They've got a long history with the communities, and because there are three organizations, because their relationship works on the ground, they were able to help the communities during that time. But as researchers, of course, we always question, was this the most effective strategy that could have been given? Could there have been something else that could have been provided to communities? But I want to come back to the issue of trust. When we talk about trust, what do we mean when we talk about local communities that we work with? I've just talked about trust between the local communities, agriculture, the municipalities, the people that they work with on a daily basis. But then there's also trust between us, researchers, and the communities. Do we go there with the right motives, or are we going there just to collect data and write our papers? That's an issue of trust. So that is why you find that most of our research, most of the projects that are being funded, they actually want to see what are the communities going to benefit out of it. And when we get to the communities, we also should be able to explain and to be able to let the communities see what we are bringing in this project. And then, of course, there's a trust between institutions themselves. How do the different institutions work with the farmers? Are they coordinated, or everyone is going to the same farmer and giving a tank, another one giving something else? So it's also important for partnerships of institutions so that they work with communities together. And it's interesting how this is at the moment being probed even at national level between ministries where things have not been working in the water sector. There is that focus as well. And of course, the last issue when it comes to trust, we are talking about trust between funders. For us researchers, it's funders between project funders, research funders. When they come in, what are the motives? What are the plans? I think I'll come back to that a little bit later, just to demonstrate how, when trust is not built between funders and the local researchers, how things might not work out, and just to demonstrate some of the issues that hinder that trust from happening. I think I'll leave it at that. I'll come back to some of the examples of how trust can be broken. Thank you.
I think, sorry if I may, I think the notion of trust and the idea of trust, it really resonates with my experience as well, particularly because 50 Liter Home, for example, had its origin in private sector organizations. But actually what we want to influence is a systems transformation in the built environment. City governments, communities play an essential role there. So how we can build that space where all these stakeholders can work together. Luckily, we have a mayor as our co-chair, but very importantly, very relevant and key partners who play an advising role on how we engage with city governments. And I'm including Scottish Water, the Water Reuse Association in the United States, the Netherlands Water Partnership, who represent that public sector voice. And building that trust, and I guess that takes me to my point, my perspective on how to build partnerships is essential, because but can only happen when the outcomes are clear. And Kim mentioned this, clarity on the objectives, what we want to achieve. When we focus on the outcomes, then we're able to identify who needs to be there and how we work together. The big problem, and perhaps there are just so many examples of failures, particularly in terms of in the development world, which is where I spent a number of years at previous jobs. There have been really dramatic and in some cases tragic experiences where the programs are created without really thinking about what they want to achieve ultimately. And sometimes those programs become a deployment of specific technologies that might not be relevant to the specific challenges that happen in the ground. And when we think about water, the geographical unit in which we need to think is basin. It's not even, a municipality, it's not even a region, it's not even a nation. It's really basins. And basins have specific challenges because some basins are urbanized, some basins are, predominantly agricultural basins, and some basins have, industrial uses there. So what is the right location? I don't think it's something that is, automatic by default, because we have a nice idea or because we have a nice technology. We cannot assume that it is appropriate for the place. So if I can contribute something to this conversation, also I think it is about identifying what are really the outcomes. Because sometimes when we think, for example, about water efficiency in a place, in a city, in a basin where there is not sufficient water, we might be creating resilience problems. Because if we make everything much more efficient, and we just, with the same resources, we give access to more people, then what happens when there is drought? What happens when there is a natural disaster? So thinking about outcomes open also our minds to think about resilience challenges, so and also equity challenges. So are we thinking about this solution for all, or are we thinking about this solution for very few? So that's would be my perspective. Outcomes can open the perspective and help us to identify really what are then the right solutions and the right partnerships to deliver on those outcomes.
Thank you, Braulio. Thank you all. That was so interesting. I'm actually taking a bunch of notes on the side because there's just so many ideas kind of coming into my head all at once. I'd like to get even a little more granular. So if all three of you could talk a bit about examples of particularly effective partnerships that you've seen, and what made them effective. I know we've talked about trust, we've talked about outcomes, we've talked about being really careful about assumptions, and looking critically about where we are, where the location focus is, and making sure that actually matches the issue and the root cause of that issue, not just the symptom that's showing. So yeah, can you talk about examples of particularly effective partnerships, and how was trust a part of that? How was the trust established? How were the outcomes established? Open it up to whoever wants to start.
Yeah, Ellie,
I can start.
Go ahead, you start.
Okay. Yeah, I think I want to pick from Brillo. He talks about outcomes, that outcomes should be defined. I want to go back and say those outcomes should be developed together with the locals, with the local communities. I think one of the big mistakes that we make is we come with outcomes, with ideas that we want to address sustainable development goal number what, and we want to address this with the communities, but probably the communities, that is not what they want. And I think one of the other big things is that there is need for an understanding of the historical perspective, how the communities have evolved. And that is a big one in South Africa, because equity issues, actually, when you talk about water, when you talk about access to resources, you need to understand the historical perspective, where a lot of communities have been deprived for years, for centuries. And if you don't understand that part of the history, you might actually just get it wrong in terms of how you create your partnerships. So I think in terms of the success of partnerships, let me refer to a partnership that we developed locally. We went out with this view of we want to understand how water is allocated and how communities participate, and we want to create partnerships between them and the CMA. And our very first engagement with the communities, it was awkward, because they were like, we don't trust this person that you came with. We don't trust the CMA at all. We've been here, we haven't had water for years. So we had to calm down and spend a lot of time building trust, making them understand why we were there, asking what is it that they needed the water for, and how much of it did they want. And in doing this, actually, we looked at communities that were in established water use associations versus the communities that were not in water use associations. And we found that those who were not in water use associations, they actually lacked a lot of information on how to access water, who to approach, and how, and everything. So as researchers, of course, we go and present our things. We took this to the institutions and we said, well, we've been to the communities and this is what we found. It was interesting how there and there, they were like, there must be something that we are doing wrong, because we are all supporting these farmers and we are not doing it. Like I mentioned before, coordination and working together was a huge challenge. And because this was a locally funded project, it was easy for us to change the objectives, to say, you know what, we are now focusing on building partnership between the institutions and the communities, the farmers and the CMA. And I must say, it took time, but what made it work, it was because we were not in a hurry to meet deadlines of the funder. Yes, there were deadlines, but because we were locally funded by the Water Research Commission, we could negotiate to say things have gone this way. We are now focusing on dialogues, on talking to farmers and creating a partnership between the farmers and the institutions. And eventually we ended up coming up with road shows of actually passing information to the communities, to the farmers, from one place to another across the catchment management area. And I must say, in that project, we ended up reaching more than 400 farmers, which when we started, we didn't even know that they existed. So when I look at it, the origins of that ability to reach so many farmers, it was because we stopped and realized that actually it's because the partnerships between the institutions and the catchment management area and the farmers were not working. So we worked on that. And I think for us, even up to now, that partnership is still working. I would call that a great success. But of course, it's locally funded. With an international funder, you might have completely different outcomes because you are rushing to meet deadline. So let me end there for now. Yeah.
Yeah, I can jump in for a moment here. So, one of the things we're interested in, and I'd love to hear from the panel about this too, is, what's the opportunity to, look at some of these local projects and, can they serve as models and can they be replicated in other locations? I know water's quite local, but so for an example, I'll bring up the topic of boreholes, right? So we have a project that we worked on in Serta, Ethiopia, and USAID came to us with that and wanted us to help with bringing the technology, and so a lot of the boreholes, a number of them are contaminated with boron or fluoride, and then unfortunately then the community has to go back to getting trucked water, walking for water. So we took kind of the approach of, can we create sort of this mobile unit that can just sort of sit on top of this borehole, and the water was actually quite hot too, which was a problem. But can we sort of dial in a technology scheme and a skid that can then potentially be replicated in other locations? And in this case, we also worked with Care Ethiopia, and one of the company that put actually the mobile unit together was from Israel. So it was just a number of different partners coming together. And we did sort of 2 levels of training as well, so that that system can have some longevity. But I guess my question is, what's the thought about taking kind of like a project like that and sort of, maybe there's a report out, maybe there's a way to connect with other communities on, this worked for this particular problem statement and locality, and can that be potentially scaled? Can those learnings be shared?
Do you want me to come, Abrela, or do you want to start? Okay. Let me pick it from there, Kim. I think the good thing is you've got this major objective of what you want to achieve. You've got ideas, whether it's goal 6 or whatever it is, that you have your strategies for Africa, for communities. The most important thing, I think, is for you to spend a bit of time developing what the structure of how you are going to implement at local level. Because as much as you come with very good intentions and everything, as long as the local communities, the local institutions, whether it's even the government, you might find that it doesn't work because you haven't spent time building that dialogue, building that trust, that common understanding. So it's important to spend a bit of time trying to build a understanding, to have common ground on what you're trying to achieve and how you are going to do it. And you should be ready for surprises, that it might take longer than you planned. Like I said, that for us, our advantage is we were locally funded. If it was an international funder, I think that project would have ended right there. So there is that part of you need to develop, as much as you've got your major goal, your major objective, go down and have your sub-objectives, develop them with the locals, with the communities, and local knowledge right at local level is very important, because communities know better what they want. I think I'll give Brenda a chance to come in also there. Thank you.
No, it's super interesting, Bongani. It's great to bring your perspective. And also, I totally agree with you. I think when those model exists, and it's a good thing that those model exists, as well as outcomes and all those constructs. But what really makes the difference is something that Bongani mentioned: taking the time to explore how those models must be adopted. Because that for me is the key, that that process of adaptation to the local context is essential. And that is for me the ingredient that makes that idea of models, or anything that comes from elsewhere, really, it can work if you take the time, programs, organizations, no matter how big or powerful an organization is, when organizations take the time to engage, to explore the relevance, there is a big difference there. And if I can connect then that's with Ellie's original question, I think for me that is what perhaps makes a difference on those examples of partnerships I was going to highlight. One is perhaps one that is more organic, that is the partnership that the city of Phoenix is created to address water stress. This is something that comes from the political leadership of the mayor, and the really interesting role that she is doing, and she's using her political capital to build this leadership, is about bringing a diverse group of voices as well as organizations to really identify the solutions that are relevant to Phoenix. And that includes not only, of course, engaging with the communities, but also inviting organizations like us, 50 Liter Home Coalition, as well as academia, very importantly, as well as private sector organizations, to really brainstorm and explore what are the solutions, where we can, where we can take Phoenix, considering that Phoenix is an American community that is in the middle of the desert, and that has an urban pattern that it's not very dense, so it's not the ideal place for creating this type of solutions. So she's saying, okay, let's discuss about this. Let's really engage. But for me, what matters is the diversity of actors. And a second example I wanted to mention, in which we are not involved, but to me is a partnership that I really admire. Perhaps it's because it's the country where I originally come from, is the Scenarios Hídricos 2030, is like hydrological scenarios 2030, which is a program funded by the Inter-American Development Bank, if I'm not wrong. And this is something that is delivered by a local foundation. And the decision that this foundation made under the leadership of, the leader is called Ulrike Broscher. Ulrike basically decided with her team that the right contribution they could make was to create evidence so that other organizations could take action. That is beautiful in terms of making sure that they can make a contribution from the space where they are, but this evidence can be then taken by politicians, by the utilities companies, by the national government stakeholders, who are then, in the obligation to take action, particularly because Chile is one of the places where water stress is going up more quickly due to climate change. So for me, those are the really interesting examples about how various stakeholders from the space where they really think about what is the contribution they can make to their communities. I think that's a really helpful approach, which, and it's an approach that I truly admire.
I've been shaking my head as you were speaking, Brilo, and that's exactly it. Thank you so much. But I have a question for both you and Kim. It's around sustainability. How do you ensure that whatever you're setting up in a country, in a community, how do you ensure that sustainability is achieved? How do you make sure that, who do you hand over to for it to continue? In our case, I said it was local and we handed over to the CMA. It's catchment management agency. It's still running, but I don't think it would be the same if it was an international funder, because they are there to find objectives and how the money should be spent. How do you ensure sustainability of your projects? Thank you.
That's a really good question. So for us, it's about the engagement with the local stakeholders. So the 50 Liter Home Coalition is exploring two avenues to create impact. The first one is about the development of pilots that basically will test technologies and ideas and solutions, including educational solutions or communication solutions, to understand, how we can achieve high water efficiency in housing. Now, for us, one of the really important learnings has been that, first of all, we need to go slowly at the very beginning so that then we can take off very quickly. But very importantly, it's about engaging with those stakeholders on the ground upfront so that they participate in the process of design of these pilots. And that is the process in which we're engaging. being is that we don't own those properties. Other organizations own those properties, and people live in those properties. So we need to make sure that those who own those properties are totally, engaged and understand what are the technologies we want to deploy, what are the solutions, how we want to communicate with people. But very importantly, those who are living there, they need to understand, what is going on in their homes, how they can, and how those solutions make their lives better. And the second avenue, which is perhaps a more strategic and more policy-orientated initiative, is around engaging with city governments. What I mentioned in Phoenix is just one of the examples of the program we are exploring, and we will be announcing toward that program towards the end of this year. But what makes really the big difference for us is that it's about engaging with those authorities that really have power and influence on how the water systems in cities are really operated, maintained, and built. And really, the reason why that's essential is exactly your point, Bongani. It's about the sustainability. We can bring a lot of ideas, we can exchange a lot of content, which is something that we're willing to do. That's why we're creating that program. But really what matters is that those are the stakeholders who are going to take that forward. So it's not only about learning as well from them, but also making sure that the ideas we identify together based on, on the program we will be announcing is really about transformation in the long term, and something that they truly own. So for me, sustainability, the key is about engaging with these people who are actually people who live there, those leaders that actually exist on the ground, and we need to respect, we need to learn from them, and we need to make sure that we make a contribution to them as well.
Yeah, I can mirror, Borrelia, what you're talking about. Again, coming from a technology solution provider, what's our role in sustainability, right? So in our case, we don't own those, whether it's a mobile unit or a UF skid or whatever, we don't own that technology solution. So that ownership has to be with the local community. Now, what needs to go with that though is training, right? So we need to have local operators who understand the equipment, who understand how to run it, who know when there's a problem, et cetera. And then because, we DuPont Water Solutions, and we have 2,500 employees all over the world, so often the reason these projects happen in the first place is there's some passionate person who's sort of in that community who kind of energizes it, right? So oftentimes there's also, just someone from DuPont or somebody who understands these things that's sort of part of that community, connected to the community. But I think the bigger thing is the ownership and the training, and making sure we're handing that off in the right way, so that there can be a sustainability. Now, the other part of sustainability, when you asked that question originally, Bongani, was like, environmental sustainability, so the other type of sustainability, at least we're starting to incorporate, at least with this next project that we're working on in Tanzania, is how do we run this? What sort of electricity source are we going to use? So in this case, we're going to be using solar panels as part of a way to kind of, provide the electricity for this next project. So I think there's a couple of different ways to think about sustainability, and both are pretty important because, as we implement, these solutions, these water solutions, they also need to be, climate resilient as well as water resilient, as been discussed.
Thank you all. And that was a great question, Bongani, so I appreciate that. I have one just looking through our questions from the audience right now, and I've got one that I would like to ask, even though we are just about to wrap up, but I'm curious to hear responses on this one. So the question is, and I think if you guys can just limit your responses to maybe a minute or so each, then we'll be able to end on time. So appreciate that. So the question is, the pandemic limited foreign travel and direct participation of international consultants, donors, et cetera, in development interventions, forcing this kind of idea of localization to really kind of be the norm during the COVID period in particular. Has this shift impacted your work? Has it been positive? Has it been negative? What changes have you seen through, particularly through COVID, in the sense of localization and partnerships? And anyone can jump in.
I think as a researcher, I must say we struggled because of lockdown and restrictions. We couldn't access the field, we couldn't access the communities. But with the relaxation of the lockdowns, we are beginning to see those partnerships building up again. I mean, it will not be the same as it was before, but I think we are making a bit of progress. But we are now doing it with that idea in mind that something can happen and we might not be able to come here. So what are the alternatives in terms of accessing the community? So we need to use institutions that are locally based so that we are not stuck when we can't go out. I think in short, I would say that. Thank you.
Kim, would you like?
Oh, okay, I'll go quick. Yeah, I would completely agree. I think if anything, just sort of slowed things down, honestly. And I think you're right that the access to the communities has been the barrier. Yeah, same experience, similar experience on our end.
Yeah, my experience is the same. I mean, I'm working here from Zurich, probably with the worst internet connection of the whole group. And establishing relationships by internet is not that easy. But one point I would debate, and it's a shame that we don't have more time, is about the fact that COVID triggered that localization. I would say internet and access to internet and access to information to mobile phones is what is triggering that localization much more, because now communities have much more information in their hands. They can see what is happening in other places. So in many cases, they will force you to deliver with at a similar level of quality, the similar level of aspiration. So I think that is perhaps the only little bit that I would add to us. What makes the big difference, what is forcing localization, is that access to information, empowerment, that in many places, access to mobile phones, access to internet is creating, which is super, super cool.
Yeah, and there's so many side topics that we could go off of from that. And one thing that I'm, and W12 in general, is really interested in is how we can use ICT to have leapfrog over some of the arbitrary and antiquated ways of reaching SDG 6 and water security. So whether it's using mobile technology or like proxy-based monitoring for groundwater systems. I mean, we're doing that with our partners in South Sudan right now. There's so many interesting things that access to mobile technology has really brought about. So I love that and completely agree. So I'm going to shift gears and start closing us out, even though this has been an extremely fast hour. So I've just jotted down a few key themes that we touched on, and I'm hoping that people listening can take this away into their work on projects, on partnerships, and going forward. So what we've heard is we should be listening, obviously, to local communities, but more than that, they should be integrated from the get-go. Outcomes should be set together in conjunction. There should really be no distinction between the power there. We need to look for assumptions in our work from the beginning, both in terms of our assumptions about where positive impact can be held, but also on what the correct area of influence is, whether it's a basin or another geographic realm. We want to get to know people as people and get a bit beyond the more professional veneer that we exist behind, as Kimberly mentioned. I think that's such a key part of building trust. And sharing knowledge between places, between organizations, between people and institutions, that's key to identifying and sharing and replicating these solutions that we are working on in different places. One thing that Bongani brought up in the beginning, and I think we all touched upon, and interestingly at EcoCiv, it's something that comes up a lot, is the need just across the globe for flexibility with deadlines and funding structures. And it's going to be really hard to have truly localized solutions if the funding side is coming in with these imposed deadlines and structures and more of a rigid approach to how our projects should be run. So I really liked hearing that emerged through this. And if there's funders listening, that's something that we're really interested in figuring out how we can structure partnerships differently so that the funding is more flexible. Overall, these things all take time, and that time is something that shouldn't be sacrificed because it does take time to build trust. The adaptation to different local contexts is fundamental, as water is a localized, lived issue, but there are elements that can be replicated and shared across differences. It's key to identify local leadership, partner with local governments throughout the entire process. And as I look at that holistic picture of what a good, strong, localized partnership looks like, I get pretty excited from the W12 perspective, because that is really the model of our hub's work. So it's fun to see everything that came out today being lived in our programmatic work. And right now we have hubs going in Egypt, in South Sudan, and in South Africa, and Johannesburg in particular. And there'll be a lot of exciting new projects that are emerging through these partnerships. So I just wanted to thank everybody again for listening in, for participating, for sending questions. I'm sorry we didn't get through all of them. And of course, a huge thank you to our panelists. This was a really excellent conversation. It absolutely flew by for me. And please do, if you're listening, sign up for our newsletter, go listen to our new podcast, Channeling Water Solutions. It's on Apple and Spotify and on our website. And join us next month. We will be having a final W12 Exchange as part of, this is a 3-part series, and we'll be having our final one in June, and more details will be available on that shortly. So thank you all, and really appreciate your time.